The airport security guard shoves the struggling elderly man forward. "Keep moving. Old-timer, you're holding up the entire line with your confusion." 61-year-old Command Sergeant Major Frank Sullivan fumbles with his shoes and belt while fellow passengers roll their eyes at his shaking hands in obvious distress, unaware that his trembling comes from severe PTSD that cost him everything after 30 years of military service. Then a young voice cuts through the crowd like a battle cry. "Sir, yes sir. Let me help you, Sergeant Major." What happens next will bring tears to your eyes and restore your faith in the bonds that unite all who serve. If stories of unexpected brotherhood move your soul, smash that subscribe button and tell us in the comments about a moment when a stranger became your hero. This reunion across generations will leave you speechless. Frank had been dreading this flight to his daughter's wedding for weeks. Air travel triggered his worst anxiety attacks, bringing back memories of transport helicopters and the constant threat of enemy fire. But Sarah was his only child, and missing her wedding wasn't an option, even if it meant facing his demons in the crowded chaos of Dallas International Airport. The security checkpoint represented everything Frank struggled with since his medical retirement 5 years ago. Loud noises, crowds of strangers, uniformed authority figures barking orders, and the feeling of being trapped with no escape route. His hands shook as he tried to remove his belt and shoes while balancing his carry-on bag and keeping his place. In the fast-moving line, the TSA officer, a middle-aged man named Roberts wearing a stern expression, watches Frank's slow movements with growing impatience. He tells Frank to hurry up and stop holding back other travelers who have flights to catch. Several passengers behind Frank start checking their phones and making frustrated comments about people who don't understand basic airport procedures. Frank drops his belt on the floor and bends down slowly to retrieve it, his back aching from old shrapnel wounds that never healed properly. A businessman in expensive suit behind him sighs loudly and complains that some people shouldn't travel if they can't handle simple security requirements without causing delays for everyone else. Roberts raises his voice and tells Frank to move faster or step out of line until he's ready to proceed through security like a normal person. Frank's hands shake worse as he tries to untie his boots, the laces knotted from his trembling fingers. Sweat beads on his forehead despite the air conditioning, and his breathing becomes shallow and rapid. A woman with 2 young children speaks up from behind the businessman, saying that her kids have better coordination than this confused old man. She suggests that elderly people who can't handle travel stress should stay home, instead of making everyone else late for their flights because of their personal limitations. Frank finally gets his shoes off but accidentally kicks one under the metal detector table. As he crawls on his hands and knees to retrieve it, more passengers join the chorus of complaints. Someone suggests calling airport medical services to deal with what appears to be a person having some kind of mental breakdown in the security line. Roberts becomes more aggressive, telling Frank that he's disrupting airport operations and needs to either complete the screening process immediately or be escorted out by security personnel. Frank tries to explain that he's just nervous about flying, but his voice comes out as a whisper that no one can hear over the noise of the busy checkpoint. The businessman checks his expensive watch and announces to everyone within earshot that he's going to miss his connecting flight because of one selfish person who can't figure out how to walk through a metal detector. His comment draws nods of agreement from other frustrated travelers who have been watching Frank struggle with growing impatience. Frank stands up with his retrieved shoe and attempts to walk through the metal detector, but the machine beeps loudly due to the titanium plates in his spine from his combat injuries. Roberts orders him back through the detector, speaking slowly and loudly as if Frank is mentally impaired rather than simply overwhelmed by the situation. A teenage girl with her family makes a comment about how embarrassing it would be to have such a helpless grandfather who can't function in normal social situations. Her parents don't correct her, instead nodding sympathetically as if they understand the burden of dealing with elderly relatives who have lost their basic competencies. The metal detector beeps again on Frank's second attempt, and Roberts calls for additional screening procedures. Frank tries to explain about his medical implants, but his words get tangled as panic begins to override his ability to think clearly. His vision starts to tunnel, and he grips the edge of the conveyor belt to keep from falling. Roberts tells Frank to raise his arms for a pat-down search while explaining loudly that some people make simple procedures complicated by failing to follow basic instructions. The crowd of waiting passengers has grown larger, with people from other security lines stopping to watch the spectacle of the confused old man holding up airport operations. As Roberts begins the invasive pat-down procedure, Frank's PTSD symptoms escalate rapidly. The feeling of hands searching his body brings back memories of being captured and interrogated during his second tour in Vietnam. His breathing becomes labored, his vision blurs, and he starts to dissociate from the present moment. The woman with children tells her kids to watch what happens to people who don't take care of themselves and end up being a burden on society. She uses Frank as a teaching moment about the importance of staying sharp and capable throughout life, not understanding that she's describing a decorated war veteran who sacrificed his mental health defending her freedom. Frank begins to sway on his feet as the pat-down continues, his face pale and covered in sweat. Roberts interprets this as defiance or drug impairment, and calls for backup security officers to assist with what he now considers a potentially dangerous situation. The crowd steps back as uniformed officers approach, giving Frank even more space to feel isolated and threatened. Then a clear, strong voice cuts through the chaos like a sword through silk. A young man in his 20s pushes through the crowd of onlookers and calls out in perfect military cadence, "Sir, yes sir. Command. Sergeant Major Sullivan, sir. Staff Sergeant Kevin Martinez requesting permission to assist, sir." The entire security checkpoint falls silent as Kevin, wearing civilian clothes but moving with unmistakable military bearing, approaches Frank with respect and recognition. Frank's eyes focus on the young man's face, seeing something familiar. In his posture and the way he carries himself with quiet confidence and dignity, Kevin explains to Roberts and the watching crowd that Frank is a highly decorated Vietnam veteran who served 3 tours of combat duty and earned the Bronze Star with the device for valor under enemy fire. He tells them that Frank is experiencing symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, a condition he developed while serving his country with honor and distinction. Roberts steps back as Kevin takes charge of the situation with calm authority. Kevin helps Frank sit down in a nearby chair and speaks to him in the steady, reassuring tone that one soldier uses with another. He tells Frank that he's safe, that he's among friends, and that everything is going to be okay. The businessman, who had been complaining about delays, now looks embarrassed and uncomfortable as he realizes he's been criticizing a combat veteran. The woman with children quietly moves her family to a different security line, unable to meet Frank's eyes after her cruel comments about his supposed helplessness and social burden. Kevin explains to the gathering crowd that he served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne Division, and that he recognizes the signs of combat stress because he's seen them in many of his brothers in arms. He tells them that Frank's condition is an invisible wound of war, as real and valid as any physical injury. Roberts asks Kevin how he knows Frank's rank and service record. Kevin smiles and explains that he researched every Medal of Honor and Bronze Star recipient from his home state when he was deciding to enlist, and that Command Sergeant Major Frank Sullivan was one of his heroes growing up. He says that Frank's actions in Vietnam saved countless lives and inspired a generation of young soldiers. Frank looks up at Kevin with tears in his eyes and asks how a stranger knows so much about his military service. Kevin tells him that he's not a stranger, but a brother in arms who learned about courage and sacrifice by studying the examples set by veterans like Frank. He explains that Frank's heroism in the jungles of Vietnam helped shape his own decision to serve his country. Kevin helps Frank gather his belongings and guides him through the rest of the security process with patience and understanding. He explains each step before it happens, helping Frank feel in control rather than victimized by the procedures. The TSA officers, now understanding the situation, treat Frank with the respect and courtesy his service deserves. As they walk toward Frank's departure gate, Kevin tells him about his own struggles with readjusting to civilian life after his combat deployments. He explains that seeking help for PTSD symptoms isn't weakness but wisdom, and that many veterans face similar challenges when transitioning from military to civilian environments. Frank learns that Kevin is traveling to the same city for a job interview with a company that specializes in hiring veterans. Kevin had noticed Frank's military bearing and posture even before the security incident, recognizing something familiar in the way he carried himself despite his obvious distress. At the gate, Kevin sits with Frank and they share stories about their different wars but similar experiences. Frank describes the jungles of Vietnam and the brothers he lost there. Kevin talks about the mountains of Afghanistan and the friends who didn't make it home. They find common ground in their shared understanding of sacrifice and service. When Frank's flight is called for boarding, Kevin helps him to the gate and salutes him with perfect military precision. He tells Frank that it was an honor to serve alongside him, even for just a few hours in an airport security line. Frank returns the salute with steady hands, his confidence restored by the recognition and respect of a fellow warrior. The other passengers who witnessed the security checkpoint incident now understand what they saw. Several approach Frank during boarding to thank him for his service and apologize for their earlier impatience and judgment. The businessman slips Frank his business card and offers help finding resources for veteran support services. Frank boards his plane with dignity intact, knowing that his military family extends far beyond his original unit or even his generation. Kevin watches from the terminal until Frank's plane disappears into the clouds, then calls his own father to tell him about meeting one of his childhood heroes at the airport. 6 months later, Frank receives an invitation to Kevin's wedding. The young veteran wants his hero to stand as an honored guest, representing all the veterans who paved the way for the next generation of American warriors. Frank accepts immediately, knowing that some bonds transcend age, era, and individual experience. What happens next will bring tears to your eyes and restore your faith in the bonds that unite all who serve. If stories of unexpected brotherhood move your soul, smash that subscribe button and tell us in the comments about a moment when a stranger became your hero. This reunion across generations will leave you speechless.